Today we're going to talk about, let's see if we can get the agenda here, the economy, tax policy, the 2014 elections, and then we're going to try to look ahead and kind of give folks an idea of where Washington policy and specifically tax policy is headed in the coming years. Goal is to do this in about half an hour with questions and everything included. First we'll start with the economy. This is a slide that caught my eye. I was over at the Chamber of Commerce a couple months ago, and the Fannie Mae folks came in and talked. Ostensibly, this is a slide.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We talked about that. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna need folks to mute their phones.
Oh, I think they get pulled out.
You didn't pull that out.
Yeah.
There we go. We got those guys. All right. Well, we have a lot of people calling in. I don't think that we were expecting quite this many people. So anyway, this is a slide that focuses on income, household median income by county. And you can see that from 2007 to 2012, the area in purple, that's the area where counties lost ground, median family income went down. The white is where they held steady. They did not rise or fall. And in the very few green counties, those are the ones where incomes went up. Now, this is about median income, but it's really about an energy revolution that's taking place, because you can see the areas that are green are dominated by the shale, the oil shale that's been discovered over the last 10 years or so, and the fracking that's taking place. The bottom line here is that energy is propping up the economy, and the fact that we're growing right now, growing at all, is really an energy story more than anything else. The second slide that we'd like to focus on is the one that shows the labor participation rate. And as you can see from this slide, the trend over the last decade or so has been significantly bad. Fewer and fewer people of working age are actively participating in the workforce. Now, part of it's not quite as bad as it might look. You can see that the high point there was the dot-com bubble. Then you had the housing bubble that burst around 2006, 2007. The net effect is that it's not really fair to compare the labor force participation rate during a bubble time, which is by definition not sustainable, with what we're hoping to recreate in the future. But nonetheless, even if you account for that, the labor force participation rate is down significantly, and that would have implications for GDP. And what we have in the third slide is a slide from our friends over at the CBO showing potential GDP versus real GDP. And the chart on the left, you can see that most of the time what happens during a recession, those are the little white areas, is that real GDP growth diverges from potential, and then you have a recovery, and it accelerates, and it gets back to potential, and everything's fine until the next economic downturn. The challenge here is that two things are happening. One, you can see that we're not quite getting back to, we haven't even gotten back to potential, and we're about 5 years out of the financial crisis. The second thing is because of that labor force participation rate chart that we just showed you, you can see that potential GDP has actually been downgraded. In the last CBO estimate that came out this year, you can see that they're expecting potential growth to be significantly less than what we have right now. So you have actual is well below. We're not getting back to trend. And then if we do get back to trend, that trend has been defined away as potential GDP. That's the problem that we have. Now, why should that be of concern to Main Street businesses? Well, one, the energy revolution is being offset by weaker economic growth. So we're not seeing the growth that we're looking for. Weaker growth means future GDP is being downgraded. Challenge is that future federal spending is not. We have not reformed our entitlement programs, and while we have done some marginal reductions in spending over the last couple of years, we have not seen the systematic reduction, particularly in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that's necessary to ensure that we have balance moving forward. Bottom line, somebody's going to need to pay for all that, and, well, the challenge for our guys is that, they pay a lot of taxes, and if tax policy is going to move in a positive direction, we're going to have to get those issues under control before that happens. Meanwhile, shifting over to federal tax policy, we can see that federal tax policy continues to be dysfunctional. The first example of that is having to do with corporate inversions. The Finance Committee had a hearing this morning focusing on corporate inversions. This is the area, this is the process by which a U.S.-based company engages in a sales transaction with a foreign-based company. The parent is now a foreign-based company, and the U.S. becomes the subsidiary. The goal or the idea behind inversions is for the U.S.-based company to stop having to pay U.S. taxes on its foreign-based income. By moving to another country, presumably a lower tax regime and one that's got a territorial system, that the U.S. company can now just pay U.S. taxes on its U.S. income only. It doesn't have to owe those taxes on its foreign-based income. You can see that back in 2000, the late 90s, 2000 inversions were an issue. Congress responded back in 2004. There was a Grassley-Baucus legislation that effectively raised the bar on inversions and required that for an inverted company to actually be considered foreign-based, it was going to need to have at least 20% new ownership. Those rules have been in place since 2004. More recently, you can see that inversions have taken control again. The primary reason for that is because while the U.S. tax code, and particularly the corporate tax code, has held steady, foreign countries have systematically reduced both their rates and, in many cases, they've moved to what's called a territorial tax system where they only tax income that's earned within their borders. And that's why you're seeing that significant rise. Lots of companies are starting to invert and move their headquarters over to Ireland and the UK. The challenge with inversions is it does have economic potentials, but it's more of a political challenge. In many cases, these inversions are not real economic transactions. They're just simply a company moving its mailing address. It opens up an office. It's got new incorporation papers, say, in UK. But its operations, its headquarters, its management continue to reside in the United States. Nonetheless, politically, it's a particularly toxic issue, and over time, I think the expectation is that Congress is going to have to address it in some way. So the hearing this morning focused on sort of competing views between the Republicans and the Democrats. Chairman Wyden used the hearing to push their solution, and I think, in fairness to him, he sees it as an interim solution. Let's stop the inversions and then let's go on and let's push for comprehensive tax reform. That said, their interim solution would be to take the bill that was passed back in 2004 and make it more potent. That would be to increase it from 20 to 50% the threshold for new ownership necessary for a diversion to be officially recognized. And then they would also impose new management and control tests to ensure that inverting company is really foreign controlled. To date, no Republicans have expressed support for this approach. So you're seeing a significant difference between now and what happened back in 2002, 2003, 2004, when you had Republican support, particularly Senator Grassley from Iowa. During the hearing, our friend Senator Hatch made clear that he was open to addressing inversions, but he included a number of stipulations. And what I find interesting, for instance, Politico put out a thing saying, Hatch expresses, openness to a solution. Yes, he did, but I think the stipulations were, in fact, the more potent part of the story. The first one was that the provision can't be retroactive. Senator Wyden would like to make whatever action Congress takes retroactive back to May 8th. Apparently, Senator Hatch does not support him in that. Two, it can't be punitive. It needs to be some sort of a positive move to make the U.S. more attractive, not to make inverting less attractive. And then third, it needs to be revenue neutral. And then fourth, it needs to move towards a territorial system. So watching Senator Hatch, listening to his questions, paying attention to sort of what he actually said, our takeaway was that what Hatch was doing was outlining a significantly different position than what Chairman Wyden, Senators Levin, and the President and the administration have outlined in terms of how they would like to address inversions. The Democrats and the administration want to raise the barrier and effectively create a higher wall for inversions to take place, make it more difficult for inversions to take place. Republicans, led by Senator Hatch, are looking towards incrementally moving towards that broader tax reform by taking some of the territorial provisions perhaps out of the Camp draft or elsewhere and enacting those by themselves, maybe kind of packaged with some other items, and then doing comprehensive reform as the two-step process. So that's effectively what we have here is a two-step response to inversions. Interim step one, move to territorial. The longer step would be to reform our tax code with lower rates and provisions to address base erosion. Significantly different views on how things are going to go. To give kind of a little background here, or sort of the broader perspective, here are what we came up with in terms of policy responses that Congress could do from good to bad in order to deal with inversions. Number one is comprehensive reform. That's the answer to making our tax code more competitive. That's the thing that everybody agrees would be the nice thing to do. The challenge, obviously, is that there's little agreement on what that would look like. Another possibility would be business reform. That is, to take something like the Grant Thornton idea that they put forward a few months ago, where you separate out business income from other types of individual income and tax those and reform that tax code. That's a possibility. The third is obviously a flawed solution, but it's repatriation. That's where every few years the Congress allows companies to repatriate their overseas income at a lower rate. We did that back in 2004. There's differences of opinion on whether it's successful or not. This time around there was a push for repatriation, but it seems like it's not really moving that fast. One of the challenges there is that the Joint Committee on Taxation gave it a very negative score, which really took the wind out of its sails. The fourth would be what Senators Levin and the administration put forward, which would be anti-inversion provisions. The challenge with those is I'm not sure how effective they're going to be. Just like with the anti-inversion provisions that were passed in 2004, companies can figure out a way around it. And if the advantage to inverting is a significantly lower overall tax burden, then they're going to figure out ways to get around these new ones as well. In fact, there's good evidence that they already have. And then finally, there's this idea that we've been fighting for the last 3 or 4 years, which is corporate-only tax reform. And there are particularly a number of challenges of that. We'd love to see the corporate tax reformed. We'd love to see a lower rate. But unless you do it in conjunction with reform of the pass-throughs and individual tax codes, all you're going to be doing is shifting the tax burden away from away from big multinationals and onto Main Street businesses, and that's not something that we support. The bottom line is none of these options have sufficient support to move forward. We believe that Congress will have to act at some point, but the fact is that there's just such a vast difference between Republicans and Democrats right now. It suggests that it's going to take a while for those differences to be bridged and for Congress to be able to move forward and act on something. The other area of dysfunction that we're seeing right now in tax policy has to do with extenders. This is a package of provisions that consistently sunset and need to be renewed by Congress. By way of example, the R&E tax credit is part of the extender package. Since 1981, it has been renewed, extended by Congress 15 separate times. So this is a regular process in tax policy. I'm not sure that it needs to be moving forward. I know that Chairman Camp would like to end it and make some of these provisions permanent and eliminate the others. But in the meantime, what the challenge we have is that in the last 2 years, Congress has failed to extend these provisions prior to their expiration date. Back in the end of 2011, all these provisions, including the R&E, the built-in gains, sales and local tax deductions, all these provisions, is about 55 of them. They expired at the end of 2011, and it took over a year before Congress went ahead and extended them, not just moving forward, but also retroactively back to January 1 of 2012. Now we're in the same position, where at the beginning of this year, they expired once again. Again, Congress hasn't acted. We're 7 months into the year. The idea is that at some point Congress will extend these, but then if they only extend them, say, a 1 or 2 year provision, we're going to be right back at trying to extend them all over again, which is very frustrating for everybody. The outlook is that Congress will take action on these, and they'll do a 2-year extension, including 2014, so make it retroactive to cover this year. They'll do it after the elections. There is a possibility that Chairman Camp prevails, and some of the provisions in the extender package are simply made permanent, removed from the extender package. There's also the possibility that some of those provisions that are less popular or perhaps a little less defensible politically will be eliminated, but that's all to be determined. They're going to have to fight that out, and most likely they'll fight that out after the elections. Good news for S-Corps is that we fully expect BIG and charitable provisions, the S-Corp charitable provision, to be part of the package. They were made permanent in the Camp discussion draft for tax reform. They are part of the Wyden extender package that he was seeking to move over on the Senate side. So we are very hopeful that those provisions continue to be part of the mix. Let's move to the elections. We've got a couple themes here, and the first theme is real easy, and that is that the House is going to stay Republican. This is a slide that we took from the website realclearpolitics.com, and as you can see, right now the expectation is that Republicans have about 230 seats for next year. House Democrats have about 188. There are 17 toss-ups. To give you an idea of how high of a challenge the Democrats have, Democrats, if they start with the base of 188, they would have to win all 17 of the toss-ups, and then they would have to win every single one, but I believe just one of the likely Republican seats that are up. So it's highly unlikely that'll happen. Something very significant would have to change between now and then. And if it doesn't, the House looks very safe and Republican. What is interesting about the House, and something we'd like to focus on, is the question what happened to the Blue Dogs. The Blue Dogs are fiscally conservative Democrats. They tend to come from the South and the Midwest. A couple years ago, back in 2009, there were 54 of them. So they made up fully about 20-25% of the Democratic conference on the House side. Today, there are only 19. And of those 19, 2 are retiring, 1's running for office, and 2 more are on the endangered list. That is, their 2 seats are most endangered of switching over to Republican. Bottom line here is that there's been a lot of focus on the disappearance of the middle in Congress, with a particular focus on Tea Party. But the bottom line is that the disappearing middle, it's a bipartisan phenomenon, and we're seeing it both Republican and the Democratic Party, and it doesn't bode well for getting things done in the future. On the Senate side, it's a complete toss-up. In fact, I think if you go to realclearpolitics.com and look at their website, there's a little thing where you can click no toss-ups, and it'll tell you that right now it's just 50-50. On this seat, you can see that there's a number of seats, particularly down in the South, that are available. Well, let's just move forward here. So our outlook for the 2014 Senate is, one, it looks a lot like 2012. In 2012, you had 33 seats up, the vast majority of which were controlled by Democrats. And many of those seats were sort of in vulnerable areas, states that could have gone either way. And so the expectation was that Republicans were going to pick up lots of seats back in 2012. In fact, they lost 2 seats. And the reason that they lost 2 seats was, one, they had a lot of Tea Party challengers in key states where you ended up with sort of populist Republican candidates, not a lot of experience. Maybe they weren't quite battle-tested, and they just didn't do very well. You also had a lack of quality candidates. Anyway, it's the same thing for 2014. Some facts I don't know. The outlook for 2014 is Tea Party challengers have been defeated. Quality candidates are significantly better. For instance, Dan Sullivan up in Alaska is a very high-quality candidate. He worked at the NSC when I was at the NEC. He's been up in Alaska, very active. His family's very active. Just a terrific candidate, and he gives Republicans a really good chance to take that seat. We have similarly good candidates down in Louisiana, up in Michigan, etc. So the quality of candidates is significantly better. Most observers, therefore, believe that Republicans have a better than even chance to control the Senate next Congress. I'm not so sure. I think it's kind of 50-50. We'll see. More importantly, in terms of the outlook, 1, the Senate's in play. 2, the House is not. The question is, does Senate control translate into significant policy changes? And from our perspective, it's going to be sort of a marginal difference. Whoever controls Congress, the margins are slim. Any significant change to the tax code would need presidential support or face a 67-vote threshold. So even if Republicans get a reasonable majority in the Senate, they're still going to have to move policy past the president. And there's such a difference in visions between where Republicans are at, where the president's at. You're going to see a lot of 67-vote thresholds there, a lot of vetoes, a lot of attempts to override the veto. Key differences then are not going to be on significant policies actually moved and enacted, but rather more marginal and focused on messaging. Confirmations are going to be a big deal. Vetoes, obviously, what I just mentioned. I'm sure that President Obama has had to veto anything so far. So in terms of messaging, sending the president something that's politically popular but something he doesn't support and has to veto, that would be a new dynamic that we haven't seen so far. And then finally, investigations, particularly like with the IRS schedule. I think you're going to see significant change in terms of the tone of the committees that are overseeing some of these investigations or would actually start some of these investigations. So that's where we're at the election. Looking ahead, we'll go back to where we started, which is with the broad macro perspective. This is a slide from a presentation that Elmendorf, the director of the CBO, gave back in May in Stanford. And I'm going to read it because it's kind of frightening in how quietly it displays how stark the budget picture is moving forward. Under current law, the future of the federal budget will be strikingly different from its past in two key ways. Federal debt will be much larger relative to the size of the economy than it has been in almost all our history, and a much larger share of federal spending will go to benefits for older Americans and for health care, and a much smaller share will go to other activities. In other words, if you take Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, and the federal debt, over the next decade, they're going to consume an increasing share of the federal budget and an increasing share of our national income, which means that there's just going to be less for everything else. And that outlook, more importantly, ignores the idea that we might go into another recession or something bad happens in the next decade. That's just sort of a steady state economy. We're looking at a fairly grim picture on the budget on the budget front. So that's the bad news. The good news is that we're going to need some leadership to take us out of that, and it's entirely possible that we've got two folks coming who, Paul Ryan is expected to take over the chairmanship of the Ways and Means Committee next year. He is currently sort of competing for it with Representative Kevin Brady from Texas, who's also terrific. And then Ron Wyden has assumed control of the Ways and Means, the Finance Committee. The combination of these two folks, at least in my mind, it gives us a little hope. These are the guys that worked together on the Ryan Wyden Medicare reform back in 2012. They have a history of focusing on long-term entitlement challenges. They're policy first problem solvers. They just work well together. And I think what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years in Washington, D.C. is more than anything else just a lack of leadership, a lack of having the right people in committee, chairmanships and running the Senate, running the House, who can actually get stuff done and work across the aisle. And my hope is that, if it's Paul Ryan working with Chairman Wyden or if it's Paul Ryan working with Chairman Hatch, if the Republicans take over, that the combination of these two personalities will create some bipartisan leadership that can get some big things done moving forward. So that's where we're at. Let's go to the conclusions. The conclusions are that energy is propping up the economy. Falling labor participation rates is a serious cause for concern. We need to get people back in the workforce because we have to pay for all those entitlements. Tax policy continues to be dysfunctional. Action likely on extenders later this year after the elections, and it's possible that we do something on inversions next year. We don't see any action on inversions between now and then. There's just simply too big of a gap between Republicans on that issue. The 2014 elections look good for Republicans, but frankly, the potential for significant policy change is limited. And then finally, something has to give. The long-term budget outlook is simply unsustainable. Meanwhile, and I guess the silver lining is that new leadership might be able to overcome differences and address tax and spending challenges. So that's where we're at. Once again, we appreciate everybody joining in. I think I knocked it right on about 25 minutes, which is what I was hoping to do. If you have a question, I think since we're kind of doing this new, we have a lot of people here. I've tried to mute most folks. Some folks, I'm going to unmute everybody. If everybody could, be quiet. And then if you want to send me a little text with a question, or if you just want to ask a question, we'll just go that way. Let's have a free forum here. So are there any questions that I haven't addressed here?
Hey, Brian.
Who wants to go first?
Can you hear me?
Hello, Catherine. Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm excellent.
Good. I have a question for you. You referenced the idea of business tax reform, and I know that that appeals to some. So there's some members of Congress who have kind of been looking into that idea. But my question is, if you try to go that path as opposed to comprehensive, is there any potential for sort of abuse of people trying to categorize income as business income to take advantage of lower rates?
The answer is absolutely, which is why we've been pushing for comprehensive tax reform and rate parity, where, regardless of whether you earn the money as an individual, wages, investment income, whatever, that the rate that you're paying, particularly the top rates, are the same or very close together. Because it's our experience, and one of our advisors, Tom Nick, testified on this before the Ways and Means Committee, that the bigger the gap you get between rates, the bigger the differential, the more opportunity there is for income shifting around and for gaming the system. So the business tax reform idea is definitely plan B. We push for comprehensive reform, but if comprehensive reform is not possible, then what we've been asking is, well, let's take a look at business reform, but make sure that business reform includes both the corporate sector and the pass-through sector. Thanks, Catherine. Are there other questions out there? All right, I'm going to give you.
Brian.
Yes.
Yeah, you had mentioned extenders getting done in the lame duck. Is there any chance that they don't get taken care of this year, and then get taken up early 2015? And is there any possibility if that happens that they're not retroactive and don't cover 2014?
Good question. I think under normal circumstances, I would say no. It's almost a certainty that extenders will get dealt with in the lame duck session after the elections. But the past couple of years have demonstrated that these are not normal circumstances. It's entirely possible that they can't come to an agreement and that the whole package gets pushed into 2015. If that happens, I think that it's almost a certainty that the extenders get done retroactively, so the companies would get benefit for the 2014 R&E tax credit and 179 expensing and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, from an economics point of view, that's kind of beside the point. I mean, the whole point of those provisions is to encourage investment, to encourage R&E activity, and if you're only providing the benefit retroactively, then are you really encouraging additional activity? But it's what we're dealing with here is not an economic issue, it's a political one. They're going to have to make them retroactive. So, thanks for the question. Anything else? Anybody else? Maybe one or two more questions and then we'll cut it off. So I think Laura Chadwick is trying to speak. Let me see if I can find her there. Okay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, we really appreciate everybody joining in. We got lots of folks on there. So we're going to, based on the number of participants, we're going to definitely do this again. We'll try to do it on a quarterly basis. In the meantime, if you have any questions or you'd like to reach out on some issues, please feel free to give us a call or contact us via email. If you go to the S Corp website, the S Corporation Association, you can get our contact